Hi, everyone. I'm going to present today my research on understanding the influence of Hyman Minsky and the impact of the financial crisis on Keynesian macroeconomic thought. This presentation is for the Washington University in St. Louis virtual undergraduate research symposium for the spring of 2021. And I'm doing this research through the Honors in Management program through the Olin Business School. So prior to the financial crisis, it was pretty common within macroeconomic thought that the financial system wouldn't have much of an impact on our economic stability. Uh, Here we have Fed chairman of the time in 2004, Alan Greenspan, explaining his opinion on this financial resiliency. Uh, However, we know by 2008 and 2009, this wasn't quite the case anymore. And many economists were grappling with how to understand this crisis, how it might impact economic stability, and what a potential recession could look like. Many economists at the time didn't think the Great Recession would be as deep and tough as it was. However, lucky there was one economist thinking about these things, and this was Hyman Minsky, who was a Washington University professor of economics between 1965 and 1990. He is one of his most famous quotes is saying that stability is destabilizing. So essentially, that when a financial investor receives returns on his risks, he's going to be more inclined to make riskier and riskier and riskier decisions. It's this kind of way of validation that's going to end up leading to fragility within the system. And this is something Minsky was thinking about and arguing back in the 1970s and 1980s, when at the time the mainstream was thinking more about long term growth uh, and not necessarily thinking about how the financial system would impact economic stability. It was very much assumed that the financial system was external to the economic system. Uh, so, looking at how Minsky got to his ideas and looking at his contemporaries, uh, modern macroeconomics is kind of said and famed to have been started by John Maynard Keynes after the Great Depression. So Keynes published the general theory in 1936, and this was his way of theorizing and trying to understand the Great Depression and looking at it against the classical economists who kind of argued that the economy would essentially self-regulate and fix itself. But Keynes believed that that was a very specific, special case that would not always work. Um, Hence the why it is called the general theory. Now, Keynes passed away within about 10 years after publishing this, and so many economists had to interpret the book on their own, and this led to two schools of thought: the neoclassical economists, which has very much kind of come to dominate mainstream economics today, as well as the post-Keynesian economists, which is where Hyman Minsky falls. So, for just additional context into where all these schools of economic thought lie, because there are a lot, and there are a lot that involve the word Keynes, um, we have John Maynard Keynes, and at the same time, we also had Friedrich Hayek and other economists such as Frank Knight arguing about this idea of market advocacy, which came to be known as the Austrian or the Chicago School, which also then led to Milton Friedman. That is separate from what I'm going to be looking at today, which is looking at the post-Keynesian Minsky impacts in their work uh, versus the neoclassical synthesis and the new classical economists. So, thinking about the 2008 financial crisis, this was the subprime mortgage crisis and the housing bubble bursting. So, a lot of debt that had just continued and continued to compile and led to a lot of default, and also led to then a lot of banks defaulting. So, you can see in this Yahoo Finance graph I have that that sharp decline is immediately following the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. And this is when a lot of media starts to kind of pick up on Minsky and the term Minsky moment starts to become more prevalent and more of much of the vernacular, especially around Wall Street. So here are some news headlines from articles such as The Economist, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal, thinking about and looking at what's going on here, what's happening within this financial crisis around the time of the financial crisis and Great Recession. So looking then at Minsky within academia, here are the numbers for citations from Google Scholar of Hyman Minsky. Some of his three biggest works. First is his book, John Maynard Keynes, which is where he fights back against the neoclassical interpretation of the general theory. Second is his book that really focuses on financial instability and this idea that stability is destabilizing. And that is the book that you see spike so much following 2008. And then the following piece is an article of his from 1992. So to just also look at a relative comparison to the neoclassical synthesis and those papers, you can tell there isn't much of a clear change following 2008. I also do want to note that there is a difference in magnitudes between these citations. Minsky gets up to being about 500 citations a year on Google Scholar, whereas these neoclassical papers, as you can tell, are closer to 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. So in order to look at this relative comparison of how the financial crisis impacted the influence of Hyman Minsky, I'm using a synthetic control model, which is a statistical analysis for comparative case studies. And it essentially looks at one group and what would have happened to that one group had the treatment not happened to them. So this is a relatively new model within econometrics and within the field. And one of the big papers is looking at the impact of German reunification on West German GDP. So the way it's done is, in this case, West Germany is the treated group, treatment is German reunification, and this synthetic control, which is an optimally weighted, artificially created control on countries that are similar to West Germany prior to reunification. This model ended up picking the USA, Austria, Japan, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And you can tell from this graph that that solid line below the dotted line shows that reunification had a negative impact on West German GDP. So looking at this model in terms of my analysis, I use Minsky's stabilizing an unstable economy as my treated group, the treatment as the financial crisis, and specifically just evidence of financial instability, because all of these papers went through the financial crisis to an extent. There is no peer control. This is looking at the relative change. My group of synthetic control was this list of neoclassical and new classical papers in economics. And you can also see the optimal weights that the data package suggested in order to show this relative change compared to neoclassical and Minsky. So here we have the final analysis. And as you can tell, similar to the prior graph on just Minsky's citations peaked tremendously following 2008, and especially relative to his neoclassical counterparts. I think it's also additionally interesting to note that while there was a clear spike till about 2010, it plateaued after that. And so I guess looking big picture, why does this matter? So while it's pretty clear that Minsky's work had grew in influence following the financial crisis and the Great Recession, the neoclassical synthesis still dominates mainstream macroeconomics. However, I think it's worth recognizing that not everything can be described by one school of economic thought. Economic thought is fluid. It changes with time. It changes based on what our main economic concerns are. And those economic concerns change. And I think it is worthwhile for the mainstream to recognize different schools of thought and different arguments. That way they can be more better prepared for potential crises that may come along the line. Because Minsky was concerned about potential financial instability back in the 70s and 80s. And then we have 30, 40 years later, this all coming to fruition. So thank you, and feel free to reach out somehow if you have any questions.